Hey guys, welcome to book review number 139. Today I am going to be reviewing Finding George Orwell in Burma by Emma Larkin. Let's see if we can get a good look at that. Okay, well, this book, Emma Larkin is a pseudonym of an author that went to Burma to essentially trace the steps of George Orwell during his time in the country, while also using a lot of the themes throughout George Orwell's books later in his life to essentially draw comparisons to modern Burma. A lot of it having to do with the totalitarianism, a lot of it having to do with the military dictatorships, a lot of it having to do with the lack of freedom of expression. A lot of it having to do with paranoia about what you can express in public versus what you can't. And really the thing that I found most interesting was that people were fairly forthcoming in the privacy of their own homes, but that did not lead to any sort of, until the last couple of years, and certainly not when this book was written in, I believe, late 90s. Any sort of reconciliation between their private grievances and demonstrations in public. Now, a lot of this has to do with fear of personal safety. I would say that the Myanmar regime, what is now known as Myanmar, what used to be known as Burma, really maybe was not totalitarian as, say, like a North Korea, or was in charge of as many everyday details as, say, like North Korea, but really people didn't know. And that lack of knowing of who was an agent and who wasn't an agent. Burma relies upon this huge network of informants, and if you inform on your brother, you get moved up the system. That really allowed itself to. Kind of the generals operate with relatively lack of popular support. Of course, another common theme in Orwellian books, particularly in 1984. Is the limiting or changing of information depending on what the powers that be wanted. And so there are numerous books, anything critical of the regime, of the military dictatorship, is banned. Any sort of books that might imply negativity, if you will, are banned. Of course, they exist on the black market, and you can get them there, but inevitably it makes them harder to get. But one of the things that the people of Burma really grasped onto was the ability to sort of read between the lines, to read what was not there. Now, that provides an interesting social context, but I think in its very nature, and this is the criticism I would have of it, will never be as exacting as a free press that can really explain and be detailed in what is going on. But rather, the people have to pick up these vague notions through what is not printed. Now, this used to be much harder in the sense that, or much easier, in the sense that they used to just like black out pages, and so, or black out names, or just, essentially use a magic marker and go over the parts that the regime did not want its people to see, which was very easy to induce. But nowadays, the regime requires submission to a central board for review before publication, and therefore it's really a lot harder to kind of deduce, at least as per the writing of this book. Let's see, other things. I should really go to the map here. So the places that Orwell spent his time, I'm just going to go over these. Mandalay, Maimyo, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, which are both in central Burma. Then he went down to Myangmo, Myaungmyo, which is in the Delta. Passed a couple other places in the Delta, including Insin, Tawadi, and Ragoon, now Yagoon. Went on to Moolsman, and then finished up in Mikanya, or maybe it's Kathia. But anyway, kind of the story of Orwell represented a young idealist that idealized, I forget the author, but they're very famous for, the author themselves, for idealizing the Raj, that being the ruling powers of India. And Orwell at the time expressed great idealism for colonialism, at least initially. But when he came to see the everyday aspects of colonialism, the brutality, the oppression, the sort of stratification between a very small white ruling class and the majority of people that really enabled them through the white people, the white rulers, the British, manipulated through the various means in order to bring them under their control. So Mandalay, it talks a lot about the tea houses there. It talks about some of the shrines. He meets with some poet laureate friends of the country, and then he eventually goes to Myanmar, which is a famous resort town, and Emma traces the steps of Orwell, that is high in the mountains, and acted as a essentially a retreat. What do they call that? Mountain retreat during the hot season to essentially climatize British people that were not used to these steaming, sweltering lowlands of Myanmar. And it still kind of retains a lot of that colonial quality. Indeed, there's some, I forget what they are, but they're very famous hotels within the cities that are now kind of gallantly worn, gallantly, there's a lot of dust, and the carpeting might be faded, and all the amenities might not work, but certainly present a sense of time and space that you just would not get in the rest of the world, in areas where the world has largely moved on from a colonial mentality. Let's see, what else? I think there was a big military base up there as well, that Emma kind of tried to enter, kind of semi-accidentally, just kind of wandering around, knowing it was in the place, but ultimately having to be escorted off the property. Later she enters the Delta. I think the Delta is one of the more interesting regions. The Delta used to be a huge rice growing region. It used to be the number one, maybe, rice producing region in the entire world during British times. But because of the collapse in the price of rice, as well as politics moving elsewhere, it essentially produces like 1/10 of the amount of rice that it did at a time period, and even a smaller percentage for export. And what you see is a lot of backstabbing in this area. You see a lot of kind of petty theft. Well, not petty theft, but almost petty governmental theft, in that government officials aren't wealthy enough, so they kind of razz the land, if you will, in order to provide for their families. Well, of course, this provides for a very inefficient infrastructure, and really lacks development for the potential of a very strong agricultural sector in the Delta as it used to be. Let's see. Later, what else do I want to say? Kind of, he taught Emma talked a lot about the beauty of the Delta, about even though the mosquitoes were unbelievably dense and aggressive, um, that the palm fronds that ran across these, kind of muddy waters, where kind of the land and the sea just kind of merged in these rice fields into one. The lushness of the region was really something that Westerners aren't used to, of this kind of almost greenhouse environment of the Delta. Um, Later, Emma moves on to Rangoon, where she sees the outside of, obviously not the interior, of the infamous prison, which I believe is in Incien, just north of Rangoon. She also notes that the power is on in Rangoon, where the power is often cut off to the rest of the society, the rest of the country, largely, because that's where the power base is. And of course, the generals are going to have their electricity 24/7. Yeah, at least in the parts of Rangoon where they live, if not the rest of society, if not even in parts of Rangoon where the power structure doesn't exist. Um, Later, she moves on to Malmin, which she describes as used to be very prosperous in teak and lumber during the British era, and much like let's see, Maimyo in the north essentially has gone into genteel decay. You see a lot of large houses that are kind of slowly kind of collapsing because just the money and the infrastructure isn't there to, keep it up. This is also famously where George Orwell wrote his poem about shooting the elephant, and it was surmised that in this area, this is where he did shoot the elephant, and kind of the metaphor of, the story is essentially that a elephant went rampaging through a city, and the residents were unhappy, and so they gathered a mob in order to hire somebody to go shoot the elephant. The elephant goes out into the field, becomes docile, and so the shooter does not want to shoot the elephant because he knows it's moved on beyond its rampage, it's out of the city. But because of the mob of people that are so unhappy, this is a metaphor for totalitarian society, for mob rule. They essentially demanded that this elephant be shot, even though the elephant obviously has no conscience of what it's doing in society. It's an elephant. And so the shooter, a lot of times, in relation to the actual event that happened under Orwell, even though it wasn't a strict non-fictional account, it was a fictional account, but fictional with ties to reality. In this account, the elephant is shot and withers and dies horribly, dies a terrible death, with blood spilling everywhere, essentially bleeding out. And by then, the village is long gone, but the result of the destruction and death remain. A metaphor for society within Burma. Lastly, goes up to Kappa, which, if not, and this was the last place that George Orwell was posted, and by this point, Orwell had a very negative view of colonialism, had seen, because really, like when you're at the top of the colonial pyramid, you see all the benefits, but really the sort of oppressive task it takes in order to do that really kind of sours one's opinion. And this is often mentioned as sort of a criticism of the Burmese, that the leaders learned from the colonial era, and really from some of the Burmese leaders prior to the colonial era, of sort of this top-down rule and of kind of oppressing the people, but removing themselves so they didn't have to see the worst of it. I should mention the Burmese leader, An Young. She's essentially the resistance leader that has led Burma to at least the fledgling start of a democracy in nowadays, but was at this point under house arrest. I'm not really sure I have much more to add, but she definitely was kind of interwoven into this book as well. Her story of the struggle of democracy versus these oppressive top-down generals. But by the point that Orwell had moved to Katha, he was very cynical, and essentially what he was looking for was kind of a post to essentially he would still have to perform his job, but there would be less responsibility because it was kind of an outpost in order to be oppressive. I guess as the Chinese would say, the emperor is far away, if you will, or the colonial rulers are far away. Um, so it kind of talks about sort of the idealism of the landscapes, the mountains, the streams. It talks about a student. Often something that's interesting in this story is how people would approach Emma just wanting to learn English, and Emma was often very reluctant because she didn't know if he was an agent or not an agent. But sometimes even the agents want to learn English, that they have even if they are an agent, they don't necessarily have intentions that are the worst. Um, and she kind of talked to this. She also met somebody like that in Melbourne, I believe, at a tea shop there. Tea shops being very, commonplace to chew the fat, if you will, kind of like a coffee shop or the bar or whatever it is in the West. Um, but she met this man in Katha that was eccentric, wanted to learn English, and ultimately she gave a few lessons, but then kind of had to move on. He seemed disappointed, and something that was interesting about that story was that even though it never was confirmed that he was an agent, but even though there was a possibility of an agent, he had an idealism for America. So it's kind of like a weird paradox in that what America stands for, at least in terms of its ideals, definitely go against the way that the Burmese rule, the Burmese junta ruled with its wide network of informants. Um, but he had this hope of eventually moving to America, or at least that's what he said. But he acknowledged that it would never happen. And that is sort of what's essentially turned out not to be true. But what a lot of people in Burma felt at this time period was, just kind of saddle the yoke, hope for the future, but expect that it will never happen. Which is kind of an interesting, a lot of what Orwell had to say, and a lot of really about this book is kind of the pessimism about the future of Burma, and then these kind of like, glimpses or little, tossings of optimism that kind of happened throughout. Well, anyway, I think I've done a pretty good job. Finding George Orwell in Burma, really good book. If you want to know about the junta state, if you want to know just kind of about the mentality of the country. I wouldn't say that it necessarily covers everything about the country or is necessarily the most, it's not a cut and dry history of the junta, but you really get a sense of what the people go through, of what they live through, of just kind of what it is to be, even if it's a little slice, because you can't see the full pie because the Burmese government doesn't allow you to do that. It lets you see just a little slice, a little taste of what Burma's like. Okay, Finding George Orwell in Burma by Emma Larson. Check it out, you guys. I'll see you later. Bye.